The windshield wipers moved back and forth like crazy, but they couldn't keep up with the snow. Amy pressed her face closer to the steering wheel, trying to see the road ahead. She shouldn't have taken this mountain route home, but the main highway was closed due to an accident. Now she was stuck on this narrow road with snow falling heavier by the minute. "Come on, just a few more miles," she whispered to herself, gripping the wheel tighter. Her phone had lost signal 20 minutes ago, and the radio was nothing but static. The car's headlights barely cut through the white curtain falling from the sky. Amy had been driving for 3 hours straight after visiting her sick grandmother in the small mountain town. She was tired, worried, and just wanted to get home to her warm apartment in the city. But Mother Nature had other plans. The road curved sharply to the right, and Amy felt the car start to slide. She'd driven in snow before, but this was different. The ice under the snow made the road like a skating rink. She tried to turn the wheel gently, remembering what her father taught her about winter driving. But it was too late. The car spun once, twice, then went sideways off the road. Amy screamed as she felt the vehicle rolling down the steep hill. Trees, rocks, and snow flashed past her window in a blur. The airbag exploded in her face and everything went dark for a moment. When Amy opened her eyes, she was hanging upside down in her seatbelt. Blood dripped from a cut on her forehead onto the car's roof below her. The engine was silent, and snow was already piling up against the cracked windshield. She tried to move her legs and immediately cried out in pain. Her left leg was trapped under the twisted dashboard, and something was definitely wrong with it. "Help!" she called out, but her voice was weak and shaky. Somebody help me, but who would hear her out here? She hadn't seen another car for over an hour before the accident. The snow was falling so hard that her car would probably be buried by morning. Panic started to set in as she realized how much trouble she was in. Amy managed to unbuckle her seatbelt and carefully dropped down to what used to be the car's ceiling. Every movement sent sharp pain through her leg. She could see that her left leg was bent at an odd angle below the knee. Even without medical training, she knew it was broken. The car was tilted at a steep angle against some trees. Amy crawled toward the passenger door, which was now above her. She pushed against it with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. The frame was twisted from the impact. She tried the driver's door next, but it was completely blocked by a large tree trunk. "Think, Amy, think," she told herself, fighting back tears. She noticed that the back window had shattered completely. Glass crunched under her hands as she crawled toward it, leaving small cuts on her palms. The cold air hit her face as she squeezed through the opening, dragging her injured leg behind her. Outside, the world was completely white. Snow was already knee-deep and still falling fast. Amy looked back at her car and realized how lucky she was to get out alive. The vehicle was crushed against 3 large pine trees, steam rising from the crumpled hood. The cold bit through her jacket immediately. She was wearing city clothes, a thin coat, regular jeans, and sneakers that were already soaked through. She had no hat, no gloves, and definitely no gear for surviving in a blizzard. Amy tried to stand but collapsed immediately when she put weight on her broken leg. The pain was so intense that she almost passed out. She sat in the snow, breathing heavily, trying to figure out what to do next. Looking around, she could barely see 20 feet in any direction. The snow was coming down sideways now, driven by strong wind that made it feel even colder. She knew she couldn't stay here. The car offered some shelter, but not enough. She would freeze to death before anyone found her. Then, through the swirling snow, she saw something that made her heart jump. A tiny yellow light flickered in the distance, maybe half a mile away. It was weak and kept disappearing behind the snow, but it was definitely there. A house! Someone lived out here. Amy started crawling through the snow toward the light. It was slow going with her broken leg, and the snow was getting deeper with every minute. She used her hands to pull herself forward, dragging her useless leg behind her. The cold snow soaked through her clothes, and soon she couldn't feel her fingers anymore. Every few minutes, she had to stop and look up to make sure she was still going in the right direction. The light seemed to get farther away sometimes, and she worried she might be going in circles. But she kept moving because stopping meant dying after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes. Amy's strength was running out. Her whole body was shaking from the cold, and she could barely keep her eyes open. The snow was now up to her chest as she crawled, and each movement forward was harder than the last. She started to think about her family, her friends, her job that she complained about but actually loved. Was this really how it would end? Frozen to death on a mountain just because she took the wrong road home? But the light was closer now. She could make out the shape of a building, a house with warm yellow windows. There were other buildings, too, probably a barn and some sheds, a ranch maybe. Amy found new energy and pushed forward faster. Finally, after another 10 minutes of crawling, she reached a wooden fence. Beyond it was a yard, and beyond that was the house with the blessed warm light in the windows. Amy pulled herself through the fence rails and collapsed in the yard. Completely exhausted, she tried to call for help, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. The wind was howling now, and snow was piling up around her as she lay there. She crawled toward the house, but her movements were getting slower and more clumsy. Her mind was starting to feel foggy, a dangerous sign that hypothermia was setting in. Just 20 feet from the front door, Amy's strength finally gave out completely. She lay face down in the snow, unable to move another inch. The warm light from the house windows seemed to mock her as consciousness started to slip away. The last thing she remembered was the sound of a door opening and heavy footsteps crunching through the snow toward her. A deep voice said something, but she couldn't make out the words. Strong hands lifted her up, and she felt herself being carried toward warmth and safety. As the world faded to black, Amy whispered a silent prayer of thanks. Someone had found her. Maybe, just maybe, she was going to survive this nightmare after all. But she had no idea that her real test was just beginning, and that the man carrying her to safety would soon face an impossible choice that would change both their lives forever. Amy woke up to the feeling of warmth against her skin and the smell of wood smoke. She was lying on a couch near a fireplace, covered in thick blankets. Her wet clothes had been replaced with dry sweatpants and an oversized flannel shirt. For a moment she forgot where she was and what had happened. Then the pain in her leg reminded her of everything. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Her leg was splinted with wooden boards and wrapped in white bandages, but she could tell it was swollen and definitely broken. "Easy there," said a calm voice from across the room. "You don't want to move too much yet." Amy turned her head and saw a man in his 40s sitting at a kitchen table. He had dark hair with some gray at the temples, weathered hands, and the kind of face that looked like it had seen both good times and hard times. He was drinking coffee from a chipped mug and watching her with concerned eyes. "Where am I?" Amy asked, her voice still weak and hoarse. "My ranch," the man replied, standing up and walking over to her. "Name's Jake. Found you passed out in my yard about 6 hours ago. You were pretty close to freezing to death? 6 hours?" Amy looked toward the windows, but all she could see was white. The storm was still raging outside, maybe even worse than before. Jake nodded. "Storm's gotten bad. Really bad. Phone lines are down and the main road is completely blocked. Won't be anyone getting up here for a few days, maybe longer." Amy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. "A few days, but I need a hospital. My leg ... She gestured weakly toward her injury. "I know," Jake said quietly. "I did what I could. Set the bone as best as possible and splinted it. But I'm not a doctor." "You're not a doctor?" Amy's voice rose with panic. "Then how did you—" "I was a medic in the army for 8 years, Jake explained. "Saw plenty of broken bones, gunshot wounds, worse things. I know enough to help, but this ... He looked at her leg with worry in his eyes. "This needs real medical attention." Amy tried to process what he was telling her. She was trapped on a mountain ranch with a stranger, badly injured, with no way to get help. The reality of her situation started to sink in, and she felt tears building up in her eyes. "Hey," Jake said softly, sitting down on the edge of the coffee table near her. "We'll figure this out. The storm will pass and then we can get you proper help. But as the hours passed, Amy's condition got worse instead of better. The pain in her leg increased, and she developed a fever. Jake brought her water and soup, but she could barely keep anything down. Her legs started to swell more, turning an angry red color around the break. By the second day, Amy was drifting in and out of consciousness. When she was awake, she was either shivering with chills or burning up with fever. Jake stayed by her side, changing the bandages and trying to keep her comfortable. But he could see what was happening. Infection had set in. Jake had seen this before in combat zones. Without proper antibiotics and surgery, infections from compound fractures could spread quickly through the bloodstream. And Amy's break was definitely compound, he could see. Where the bone had punctured through the skin before he bandaged it up, he looked through his medical supplies, which were mostly meant for treating injured cattle and horses. He had some antibiotics for animals, but he wasn't sure if they would work on humans or what the right dosage would be. He had cleaned the wound as best he could, but it wasn't enough. On the third day, Amy's fever spiked dangerously high. She was talking nonsense, calling out for people who weren't there, and sometimes she didn't even recognize Jake when he spoke to her. Her leg had swollen to twice its normal size, and red streaks were starting to appear on her skin, a sign that the infection was spreading. Jake sat beside her, feeling helpless and scared. He had saved lives in the army, but this was different. In Afghanistan, he always had backup, helicopters for medical evacuation, and proper equipment. Here, he was completely alone with a dying woman and no way to get help. That evening, during one of Amy's brief moments of clarity, she grabbed his hand with surprising strength. "Jake," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear and pain. "I can feel it, the infection. It's getting worse, isn't it?" Jake wanted to lie to her, to tell her everything would be fine, but something in her eyes stopped him. She deserved the truth. "Yeah," he said quietly, "it's bad." Amy closed her eyes and took a shaky breath. When she opened them again, tears were streaming down her face. "I don't want to die slowly," she said. "The pain ... It's so bad. And if the infection reaches my heart or brain ... She squeezed his hand tighter. "Please, Jake, if it comes to that, if there's no hope ... Please just end it fast. Don't let me suffer." Jake felt like someone had punched him in the chest. He stared at Amy's pale, fever-flushed face and saw the desperate plea in her eyes. She was asking him to kill her if she was dying anyway. To end her suffering. "Amy, don't talk like that," he said, but his voice cracked a little. "We're going to get through this." "Promise me," she insisted, her grip on his hand getting weaker. "Promise me you won't let me suffer." "I'm scared, Jake. I'm so scared of dying in agony." Jake couldn't answer. He just sat there holding her hand as she slipped back into feverish unconsciousness. Outside, the wind howled and snow continued to pile up against the windows. The storm showed no signs of stopping. That night, Jake sat at his kitchen table, staring at his old service pistol. It was a Colt .45 that he'd carried through 3 tours of duty. He'd never thought he'd have to consider using it for something like this. Amy's breathing was getting more labored, and her fever was so high that she was having seizures. The infection was winning, and Jake knew that without immediate surgery and strong antibiotics, she was going to die. Probably within the next day or two. The question was, would he honor her request if it came to that? Could he actually end another person's life, even to stop their suffering? Jake had killed people in war, but that was different. This would be mercy, not combat. He picked up the gun and checked the chamber out of old habit. 6 bullets. More than enough. All he would have to do is wait until Amy was clearly dying, until there was absolutely no hope left. And then ... Jake set the gun down on the table and put his head in his hands. He'd been trained to save lives, not take them. But he'd also seen what a slow death from infection looked like, and it wasn't pretty. Amy was right to be scared. As dawn broke on the 4th day, Jake made a decision. But it wasn't the decision Amy had asked for. As he looked at her lying there, barely breathing, burning up with fever, he realized there was one more option. One desperate, dangerous option that Amy didn't know about. It was crazy, it was risky. It might kill her anyway. But it was the only chance she had. Jake walked to his gun safe and took out a different tool, his field surgery kit from the army. If he was going to save Amy's life, he would have to do something that terrified him more than any battle he'd ever fought. He was going to have to cut off her leg. Jake stared at the surgical tools laid out on his kitchen table. Scalpels, bone saw, clamps, sutures, everything he'd need to perform an amputation. His hands were shaking as he arranged them in order, just like he'd been taught in field medic. Training 15 years ago, he'd never actually done an amputation before. He'd assisted with a few in field hospitals, but never been the primary surgeon. The closest he'd come was removing shrapnel and treating gunshot wounds. This was completely different. This was removing a whole limb to save a life. Amy was unconscious. On the couch, her breathing shallow and rapid. Her temperature was 104 degrees, and the red lines from the infection had spread halfway up her thigh. Jake knew he had maybe 6 hours before the infection reached her vital organs. After that, nothing would save her. He'd spent the morning preparing everything he could think of. He'd sterilized his kitchen table with bleach and covered it with clean sheets. He'd gathered every painkiller he had, both human and veterinary. He'd even found some antibiotics meant for treating sick cattle that might help fight the infection. But looking at Amy lying there, burning up with fever, Jake wondered if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. What if he was wrong about the infection? What if there was still a chance her body could fight it off? What if he cut off her leg and she died anyway? His cell phone sat silent on the counter, still no signal. The radio continued to broadcast. Nothing but static and emergency weather warnings. The storm had been going for 4 days straight, and the snow was now piled up to the windows. Even if the weather cleared tomorrow, it would take days to dig out the roads. Jake walked over to Amy and checked her pulse. It was fast and weak. Her skin was hot and dry, and she was making little whimpering sounds even though she was unconscious. The pain must be terrible, even in her current state. "Amy," he said softly, shaking her shoulder gently. "Amy, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, but they weren't really focused. She was looking at him, but Jake could tell she wasn't really seeing him. "It hurts," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Jake, it hurts so much." "I know," he said, brushing her sweat-soaked hair away from her face. "Amy, listen to me. I think I can help you, but I need to do something drastic. Something that will change your life forever." Amy's eyes cleared a little bit, and she seemed to understand what he was saying. "The infection is too bad," Jake continued. "Your leg... I think I need to remove it. It's the only way to stop the poison from spreading to the rest of your body." Amy stared at him for a long moment. Jake could see her trying to process what he'd said through the fever and pain. "Cut off my leg?" she whispered. "Yes, from just below the knee. It's your only chance, Amy. Without it, the infection will kill you in the next few hours." Amy closed her eyes, and Jake thought she'd passed out again. But then she spoke, so quietly he had to lean down to hear her. "Please," she said. "Just, end it fast. I can't take any more pain." Jake's heart broke. She thought he was talking about killing her quickly instead of letting her die slowly from the infection. She had no idea he was planning to try to save her life. He said firmly, taking her hand. "I'm not giving up on you. I'm going to try to save you. But I need you to trust me." But Amy had already slipped back into unconsciousness. Her breathing was getting more labored, and Jake knew he was running out of time. Every minute he waited. The infection spread further through her system. Jake went to his bathroom and scrubbed his hands and arms like a surgeon preparing for operation. He'd done this routine hundreds of times in field hospitals, but never for something this serious. Never when someone's life depended entirely on his skills and nothing else. He carried Amy to the kitchen table and positioned her as carefully as possible. Her broken leg hung at an odd angle, swollen and discolored. The smell of infection was getting stronger, a sickly sweet odor that Jake remembered all too well from combat zones. Jake gave Amy injections of every painkiller he had. Morphine from his old medic kit, lidocaine for local anesthesia, even some tranquilizer meant for horses. He wasn't sure about the dosages, But he figured it was better to risk an overdose than to have her wake up during the surgery. He put a tourniquet around her upper thigh to cut off blood flow to the infected area. Then he took a deep breath and picked up the scalpel. "Please let this work," he whispered to himself. Jake made the first incision through the skin, just below Amy's knee. Blood immediately started flowing, but not as much as he'd expected. The infection had damaged a lot of the blood vessels. He worked quickly but carefully, cutting through muscle and tissue, trying to remember everything he'd learned about anatomy. The hardest part was cutting through the bone. Jake had to use a small bone saw, and every cut made a horrible grinding sound that echoed through the quiet house. He tried not to think about what he was doing, that he was cutting off a young woman's leg in his kitchen. He just focused on the technical aspects, the steps he needed to complete to save her life. It took him almost 2 hours to complete the amputation. When he finally finished, Jake was covered in sweat and blood, and his hands were cramping from gripping the surgical tools so tightly. Amy's leg, from just below the knee down, lay on a towel beside the table. Jake carefully cleaned and stitched the wound, then wrapped it in sterile bandages. He gave Amy antibiotics and more painkillers, then carried her back to the couch by the fireplace. Her pulse was still weak, but it seemed a little steadier than before. Now came the hardest part, waiting to see if the surgery had worked. Jake sat in his chair and watched Amy breathe, looking for any signs of improvement or deterioration. Outside, the storm continued to rage, and inside, the fire crackled softly in the fireplace. Jake looked at his hands, still stained with blood despite multiple washings. He'd just cut off a woman's leg in his kitchen. Either he'd saved her life, or he'd just made her final hours even more horrible than they already were. As the sun set on the 4th day of the storm, Jake pulled a chair up next to the couch and settled in for a long night of watching and waiting. Amy's fever was still high, but it didn't seem to be getting worse. The red lines from the infection had stopped spreading up her thigh. Maybe, just maybe, he'd done the right thing. But Jake knew that even if Amy survived, she would never forgive him for what he'd done. When she woke up and realized her leg was gone, she would hate him for making that choice without her permission. He'd saved her life by destroying it. And Jake wasn't sure which one of them would have the harder time living with that decision. The first 24 hours after the surgery were the longest of Jake's life. He barely slept, checking Amy's temperature and pulse every hour, watching for any sign that the infection was coming back or that she was bleeding internally. Amy remained unconscious, which was probably a blessing. Her body was fighting to recover from the trauma of losing a limb, and consciousness would only bring pain and questions that Jake wasn't ready to answer yet. On the positive side, her fever had dropped from 104 to 101 degrees. The red lines from the infection had stopped spreading and were actually starting to fade. Her breathing was deeper and more regular. The surgery seemed to be working, but Jake knew the next few days would be critical. Amputation was major surgery, and he'd performed it in a kitchen with veterinary supplies. There were 100 things that could still go wrong. Infection could set in at the surgical site. She could develop blood clots. Her body could go into shock from the trauma. Jake cleaned and rebandaged the surgical site every few hours, checking for signs of new infection. The stump looked raw and painful, but it was healing cleanly. He gave Amy antibiotics around the clock and monitored her vital signs constantly. On the 2nd day after surgery, Amy started to wake up. At first, it was just brief moments of consciousness. Her eyes would flutter open. She'd look around confused, then drift back to sleep. Jake was always there when this happened, talking to her softly and giving her water. "You're safe," he would tell her. "You're going to be okay. Just rest." Amy seemed to understand his voice, even though she couldn't respond yet. Sometimes she would squeeze his hand weakly before falling back asleep. Jake used these quiet hours to think about what he would tell her when she was fully awake. How do you explain to someone that you cut off their leg to save their life? How do you justify making such a huge decision for another person without their permission? He kept remembering her whispered plea, "Please, just end it fast." She'd been asking him to kill her, to end her suffering. Instead, he'd chosen to save her life by taking her leg. Jake wondered if Amy would see that as a betrayal or as a gift. The storm finally started to calm on the 6th day. The wind died down, and the snow changed from a heavy blizzard to light flakes. Jake looked out his windows and saw blue sky for the first time in almost a week. But the snow was still too deep for any vehicles to get through. It would be at least another few days before the county road crews could clear the mountain roads. On the 7th day, Amy woke up fully for the first time. Jake was sitting beside her reading an old magazine when he heard her voice. "Water," she said hoarsely. Jake immediately set down the magazine and reached for the glass he always kept nearby. He helped her sit up a little and held the glass to her lips. Amy drank gratefully, then looked around the room with clear, alert eyes. "How long have I been out?" she asked. "About 3 days since you've been really awake," Jake said carefully. "The surgery was 4 days ago." Amy looked confused. "Surgery? What surgery?" Jake's heart sank. This was the moment he'd been dreading. He sat down on the edge of the coffee table so he was facing her directly. "Amy, do you remember how sick you were? The infection in your leg?" Amy nodded slowly. "It was bad, really bad. I remember the fever and the pain." She paused, and Jake saw the exact moment when she realized something was wrong. Her eyes went wide and she looked down at her body under the blankets. "My leg," she said quietly. "I can't feel my leg." "Amy," Jake said gently, "the infection was going to kill you. It was spreading through your bloodstream, and there was no way to get you to a hospital. I had to make a choice." Amy pulled back the blankets and stared at where her left leg ended just below the knee. The surgical site was neatly bandaged, but the absence of her lower leg and foot was unmistakable. For a long moment, Amy didn't say anything. She just stared at the empty space where the rest of her leg should have been. Jake watched her face go through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally anger. "You cut off my leg?" she said, her voice getting louder. "You cut off my leg without asking me." "Amy, you were dying," Jake said. The infection had spread too far. In another few hours, it would have reached your heart and brain. You would have died. I told you to end it fast." Amy shouted, tears streaming down her face. "I told you not to let me suffer. This isn't what I meant." "I know," Jake said quietly. "But I couldn't kill you. I couldn't just give up when there was still a chance to save you." Amy turned away from him, sobbing. "You had no right. No right to make that choice for me. Do you have any idea what you've done? My whole life is ruined." Jake felt like he'd been stabbed in the chest. He'd known this would be hard, but hearing the pain and anger in Amy's voice was worse than he'd imagined. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But you're alive, Amy. You're alive, and that has to count for something." "Alive?" Amy laughed bitterly. "You call this alive? I'll never walk normally again. I'll never run, never dance, never be the person I was before. You saved my life by destroying it." Jake didn't know what to say to that. She was right in a way. He had changed her life forever without her permission. But he'd also saved it, and he couldn't bring himself to regret that choice. Over the next 2 days, Amy barely spoke to him. She answered his medical questions and let him change her bandages, but otherwise she stared out the window or slept. Jake could see her processing her new reality, and it was clearly devastating. Jake tried to give her space while still taking care of her medical needs. He cooked meals she wouldn't eat and brought her books she wouldn't read. The tension in the small house was thick enough to cut with a knife. On the 9th day after the storm started, Jake heard the distant sound of a snowplow on the main road. Civilization was finally coming back to the mountain. Soon, Amy would be able to get proper medical care and go back to her old life. But as Jake looked at her lying on the couch, staring at nothing, he wondered if either of them would ever really recover from what had happened in this house. He'd saved her life, but he'd also taken something from her that could never be replaced. The question was, would Amy ever forgive him for making that choice? And more importantly, would she ever forgive herself for wanting to give up when there was still hope? As the sound of the snowplow got closer, Jake realized that the hardest part of this whole experience wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. The sound of the snowplow grew louder as it worked its way up the mountain road. Jake looked out the window and saw the first vehicle he'd seen in over a week. A big Orange County truck pushing massive amounts of snow to the sides of the road. Behind it followed an ambulance and a sheriff's deputy. "They're here," Jake announced to Amy, but she didn't respond. She'd been staring at the ceiling for the past hour, barely acknowledging his presence. Jake went outside to meet the rescue crew. The paramedics, Tom and Kelly, were people he knew from the small mountain community. They'd responded to ranch accidents before. "Jake, thank God you're okay," Tom said as he climbed out of the ambulance. "We got reports of a car accident up here, but with the storm, we couldn't get through until now." "The accident victim is inside," Jake said. "She's stable, but she's been through a lot." Kelly grabbed the medical kit and followed Jake toward the house. "How bad are her injuries?" Jake stopped at his front door and turned to face both paramedics. "I need to tell you something before we go in. She had a compound fracture of the left leg that got badly infected. I had to perform an emergency amputation to save her life." Tom and Kelly exchanged shocked looks. "You did an amputation?" Kelly asked. "Here? I'm a former Army medic," Jake explained. "It was either that or let her die from sepsis. I had no choice." Inside, the paramedics examined Amy while Jake explained everything that had happened. Amy answered their medical questions, but refused to look at Jake. When they asked her about the surgery, she just said, "He did it without my permission." "Ma'am," Tom said gently, "from what Jake is telling us and what we can see, you were dying from infection. The amputation probably saved your life." "I didn't want my life saved," Amy said flatly. "Not like this." The paramedics prepared Amy for transport to the hospital. As they loaded her onto a stretcher, she finally looked directly at Jake for the first time in days. "I never want to see you again," she said. Her voice was calm, but Jake could see the pain and anger burning in her eyes. "What you did to me, I'll never forgive you for it." Jake watched the ambulance drive away, taking Amy back to the world she'd come from. He stood in his yard until the red lights disappeared around the bend, then went back inside his empty house. The next few days were strange and quiet. Jake cleaned up all the medical supplies and tried to get his house back to normal, but everywhere he looked, he was reminded of Amy, the couch where she'd laid for over a week, the kitchen table where he'd performed the surgery, the bloodstains he couldn't completely scrub out of the wood floor. A week later, Sheriff Davis came by to take Jake's official statement about the accident and rescue. He'd already talked to Amy at the hospital, and Jake could tell from his expression that it hadn't gone well. "She's pretty angry at you," the sheriff said, settling into a chair at Jake's kitchen table. "Says you had no right to make that decision for her." "I know," Jake said, "but what was I supposed to do? Let her die?" "Legally, you're probably in the clear," Sheriff Davis said. "Emergency medical situations, especially when someone's life is in immediate danger, give you some protection. But emotionally, he shook his head. "That's a different story," Jake nodded. He'd been thinking about the same thing for days. Legally, he might be safe, but morally? That was much more complicated. "How is she doing?" Jake asked. "Physically, she's healing well. The doctors at the hospital said you did a remarkably good job with the surgery. Probably saved her life, just like you said." Sheriff Davis paused. "But mentally she's struggling. Won't talk to the counselors, won't do physical therapy, just stares out the window most of the time." Jake felt a stab of guilt. He'd saved Amy's body, but her spirit seemed broken. 2 weeks after Amy left, Jake got an unexpected visitor. Dr. Helen Martinez from the regional hospital drove up to his ranch in her personal car. Jake had met her a few times when he'd brought injured ranch hands to the emergency room. "I wanted to talk to you about Amy," Dr. Martinez said as Jake invited her in for coffee. "I've been treating her since she arrived." "How is she?" Jake asked. "Physically, she's doing well. Your surgery was clean and professional. I've seen trained surgeons do worse work in fully equipped operating rooms." Dr. Martinez studied Jake's face. "But I'm worried about her mental state. She's given up. Won't participate in her own recovery." Jake poured coffee for both of them and sat down across from the doctor. She hates me for what I did. I know. But I also know you saved her life. The infection had spread to her blood. Another few hours and she would have died, no question about it. Dr. Martinez took a sip of her coffee. The problem is, Amy can't see past her anger right now to understand. That maybe she never will, Jake said. Maybe I should have just done what she asked? You mean kill her? Dr. Martinez shook her head. Jake, in 30 years of medicine, I've learned something important. People who are dying, especially when they're in terrible pain, often ask for death. But most of them, when they recover, are grateful to be alive. Amy might get there too, but it's going to take time. After Dr. Martinez left, Jake found himself thinking more and more about Amy. He wondered what she was doing, how she was coping, whether she was learning to live with her new reality. Part of him wanted to visit her at the hospital, but he knew she didn't want to see him. 3 weeks after the rescue, Jake was surprised to get a phone call from Amy's sister, Lisa, who lived in the city. I wanted to thank you, Lisa said, for saving my sister's life. How did you get my number? Jake asked. Sheriff Davis gave it to me. He told me what really happened up there. Lisa's voice was emotional. Amy won't talk about it, but I know she was dying. You did what you had to do. Your sister doesn't see it that way, Jake said. Amy's always been stubborn, Lisa replied. Even as a kid, when she made up her mind about something, nothing could change it. But she's also strong. Stronger than she knows right now. Lisa told Jake that Amy was being discharged from the hospital the next day. She was going to stay with Lisa while she figured out what to do next. The doctors had recommended a rehabilitation center that specialized in helping amputees learn to walk with prosthetic legs, but Amy had refused to even consider it. She's giving up on life, Lisa said, and I don't know how to help her. After he hung up the phone, Jake sat in his quiet house and thought about the choice he'd made. He'd saved Amy's life, but at what cost? She was alive, but she wasn't really living. She was breathing, but she'd lost her will to exist. Jake wondered if maybe Amy had been right. Maybe he should have honored her request and ended her suffering quickly instead of forcing her to live with a permanent disability. Maybe death would have been more merciful than the life he'd given her, but deep down, Jake still believed he'd made the right choice. Life was precious, even when it was difficult, even when it was painful, even when it was different from what you'd planned. The question was, would Amy ever come to see it that way? Or would she spend the rest of her life hating him for the decision he'd made in that kitchen during the worst storm he'd ever seen? As winter slowly gave way to spring, Jake tried to get back to his normal routine. But everything felt different now. He'd saved a life, and somehow that had changed him in ways he was still trying to understand, and somewhere in the city below, Amy was trying to figure out how to live with what he'd done. The storm was over, but for both of them, the real weather was just beginning. 2 months after leaving the ranch, Amy was back. Not by choice, but because her sister Lisa had driven her up the mountain despite her protests. Amy sat in the passenger seat of Lisa's car, staring out at Jake's ranch with a mixture of anger and dread. I can't believe you're making me do this, Amy said for the 10th time during the drive. You need closure, Lisa replied, parking the car in Jake's driveway. You've been living like a ghost for 2 months. Maybe talking to him will help. Amy looked down at her prosthetic leg, still unfamiliar and uncomfortable even after weeks of physical therapy. She'd finally agreed to get fitted for it, but only because Lisa had threatened to stop letting her live in her apartment if she didn't try to move forward with her life. Jake appeared on his front porch, clearly surprised to see them. He walked slowly toward the car, and Amy noticed something she hadn't seen before during those chaotic days in his house. Jake was limping, badly. Amy, Jake said when she got out of the car with her crutches. I wasn't expecting to see you. This wasn't my idea, Amy said coldly, but she was distracted by watching how he moved. His left leg seemed stiff, and he favored his right side heavily. Lisa introduced herself and explained why they'd come. Amy's been struggling with what happened. Her therapist thought it might help if she could talk to you, ask questions, maybe understand your perspective. Jake invited them inside, and Amy reluctantly followed. The house looked exactly the same, except cleaner. She could see the spot on the kitchen table where she imagined the surgery had taken place, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. They sat in the living room. Amy on the familiar couch where she'd spent so many days recovering. The conversation started awkwardly, with Lisa doing most of the talking while Amy and Jake avoided eye contact. "Why?" Amy finally asked, looking directly at Jake for the first time. "Why didn't you just do what I asked?" "I begged you to end it quickly." Jake was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully, because I've seen what it's like to give up hope. I've been there myself, and I knew that if you survived, you might feel differently about wanting to die. "Feel differently?" Amy's voice rose. "My life is ruined. I can barely walk. I can't do half the things I used to do. How is this better than dying?" "Because you're here," Jake said simply. "You're breathing, you're talking, you're feeling angry. That's all part of being alive." Amy stood up abruptly, her prosthetic leg making the movement awkward. "Easy for you to say. You didn't lose a limb." Jake looked at her steadily, then slowly rolled up his left pant leg. Amy gasped when she saw the prosthetic leg underneath, much more advanced and worn than her own. "I lost mine 8 years ago," Jake said quietly. "Roadside bomb in Afghanistan. Took my leg and killed 3 of my squad mates." Amy stared at the prosthetic, her anger momentarily replaced by shock. You have a prosthetic too?" "Above the knee," Jake said, rolling his pant leg back down. "Much worse than yours, actually. At least you still have your knee joint." Lisa looked between them, understanding dawning on her face. "That's why you knew you could save her. You'd been through it yourself." Jake nodded. "When I first lost my leg, I wanted to die too. Spent months in the hospital, then more months in rehab, hating everyone who tried to help me. I was angry at the world, angry at myself, angry at God." Amy slowly sat back down, her mind reeling. All this time, she'd been furious at Jake for making a decision about her life without understanding what it would mean. But he did understand. Better than anyone. "How did you ... Amy started, then stopped. "How did you get through it? Honestly?" "It took years," Jake said. "The physical therapy was hard, but the mental part was harder. Learning to see myself as something other than broken. Learning that different doesn't mean worthless." Jake told them about his struggle after losing his leg. How he'd pushed away friends and family, how he drank too much and isolated himself on the ranch. How he'd contemplated suicide more than once during those first dark months. What changed? Lisa asked gently. "Time, mostly. And realizing that my life could still have meaning, even if it looked different than I'd planned." Jake looked at Amy. "I wasn't always a rancher. Before the army, I wanted to be a doctor. Losing my leg meant I couldn't do surgery the way I'd dreamed, but it also taught me things about healing that medical school never could." Amy felt tears starting to form in her eyes. For 2 months, she'd hated Jake, blamed him for ruining her life. But sitting here, listening to his story, she realized he'd saved her not just from death, but from the regret he carried about not being able to save his squad mates. "I've been so angry," Amy said, her voice breaking. "So angry at you, at the world, at myself." "Anger is normal," Jake said. "I was angry for a long time. But staying angry forever, that's just another way of dying." They talked for hours that afternoon. Jake showed Amy how he'd adapted his ranch work to accommodate his disability. He demonstrated how he mounted horses, how he handled tools, how he'd learned to do almost everything he'd done before, just differently. "The first year is the hardest," he told her. "Your brain keeps forgetting that your leg is gone. You'll try to step on it, feel phantom pain, think you see it in mirrors. But gradually your new normal becomes just ... normal." Amy asked questions she'd been afraid to ask her doctors and therapists. About pain, about relationships, about whether people would see her differently. Jake answered honestly, not sugarcoating the challenges but also not making them seem insurmountable. Do you ever regret it? Amy asked as the afternoon wore on. Choosing to live with this instead of dying. Jake shook his head. No, there are hard days, days when everything feels impossible. But there are also good days. Days. When I help an injured animal heal, or when I watch a sunset from my porch, or when I save someone's life during a blizzard. For the first time since the accident, Amy felt something other than anger and despair. She felt curiosity about what her life might look like if she stopped fighting against her new reality and started working with it. Lisa had been quiet for most of the conversation, but as they prepared to leave, she spoke up. Jake, would you mind if Amy came back to visit? Maybe you could help her with some of the practical stuff, the things the therapists can't really teach. Jake looked at Amy. Only if she wants to, Amy hesitated. Part of her still wanted to blame Jake for everything that had happened. But a bigger part was starting to realize that he might be the only person who truly understood what she was going through. Maybe, she said, maybe that would be okay. As they drove back down the mountain, Amy was quiet, processing everything she'd learned. Jake wasn't the villain she'd made him out to be in her mind. He was someone who'd faced the same impossible choice between death and a difficult life, and he'd chosen life. Not just for himself, but for her too. Feeling any different? Lisa asked as they reached the main road. Amy looked back toward the ranch, now hidden by trees and distance. I don't know. But for the first time since the accident, I think I might want to find out what happens next. It wasn't forgiveness yet, and it wasn't acceptance, but it was a start. And sometimes Jake had told her, a start is all you need to begin healing. 3 weeks after her first visit back to the ranch, Amy returned alone. This time, she drove herself, having finally gotten cleared to drive with her prosthetic leg. The drive up the mountain was nerve-wracking, but she was determined to prove to herself that she could do it. Jake was working in his barn when she arrived, and she could hear him talking gently to one of his horses. Amy stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him work. His movements were confident and skilled, and if she hadn't known about his prosthetic, she might not have noticed his slight limp. Amy, Jake said when he saw her, surprised and something. That looked like happiness crossing his face. You drove yourself up here? First time driving on the mountain since the accident, Amy admitted. I was terrified the whole way, but I made it, Jake smiled. That's a big step. How does it feel? Scary, but also good, I think. Amy looked around the barn, taking in the horses, the tools, the organized chaos of ranch life. Is that offer still open to teach me some of the practical stuff? Over the next several hours, Jake showed Amy how he'd adapted to ranch work with one leg. He demonstrated how he'd modified his truck to make it easier to get in and out, how he used different techniques for mounting horses, and how he'd set up his workspace to minimize the challenges of his disability. The key is not to fight against what you can't do, Jake explained as he showed her how he fed the horses. Focus on finding new ways to do what you want to do. Amy tried some of the techniques he showed her, frustrated at first by how clumsy she felt. But Jake was patient, offering encouragement and practical tips without being condescending. I used to ride horses when I was a kid, Amy said as they stood next to Jake's gentlest mare, a brown horse named Rosie. I haven't even thought about it since the accident. Want to try? Jake asked. Rosie's very calm and I can help you. Amy's first instinct was to say no. The idea of trying to mount a horse with her prosthetic seemed impossible and scary. But something in Jake's expression made her reconsider. Okay, she said. But if I fall and break something else, I'm definitely blaming you. Jake laughed, the first time Amy had heard him really laugh. It was a warm, genuine sound that made her realize how serious and guarded he usually was. Getting on the horse was awkward and required Jake's help, but once Amy was in the saddle, something magical happened. She felt tall and strong again, connected to the animal beneath her and to a part of herself she'd thought was lost forever. They rode slowly around Jake's property, with him walking alongside to make sure she felt secure. Amy found herself smiling for the first time in months as they moved through the peaceful mountain landscape. This is amazing, she said. I forgot how much I love this. Horses don't care if you have one leg or two, Jake said. They respond to confidence and kindness. Kind of like people, actually. After that first riding lesson, Amy started visiting the ranch regularly. Sometimes once a week, sometimes more often. Jake never asked why she came or how long she planned to stay. He just welcomed her and found ways to keep her busy and engaged. Amy helped with feeding the animals, learned to repair fences, and even assisted when Jake had to treat sick cattle. She discovered that ranch work was physically demanding but also deeply satisfying in a way her office job had never been. "I never thought I'd say this," Amy told Jake one afternoon as they watched the sunset from his porch, "but I actually feel stronger now than I did before the accident." "Physically?" Jake asked. "No, not physically, although that too, actually. But I mean mentally, emotionally." Amy struggled to find the right words. "Before the accident, I thought I was strong because nothing really bad had ever happened to me. But now I know I'm strong because something terrible did happen, and I survived it." Jake nodded, understanding. Adversity has a way of showing us who we really are. Most people are stronger than they think. As spring turned to summer, Amy's visits became longer and more frequent. She started helping Jake with bigger projects around the ranch, learning skills she'd never imagined needing. She discovered she had a natural talent for working with the animals, and Jake began relying on her help more and more. "You know," Jake said one day as they worked together to build a new fence, "I've been thinking about expanding the ranch operation. Maybe starting a program to help other people like us." "Like us?" Amy asked. "People who've had to rebuild their lives after losing limbs. There are therapeutic riding programs, but not many that combine that with real ranch work, real purpose." Jake paused his hammering and looked at Amy. "What do you think?" Amy considered the idea. "You mean like a working ranch where people could come to learn and heal?" "Exactly. Give people a chance to discover that disability doesn't mean inability. Show them that they can still do meaningful work, still contribute, still have adventures." The more they talked about it, the more excited Amy became. She started researching similar programs, looking into funding sources, and even sketching out ideas for accessible facilities. "I think I'd like to be part of something like that," Amy told Jake one evening as they sat on his porch. "I mean, if you were serious about it." "I was serious," Jake said. "But Amy, you should know, this place, this life, it's not easy. The winters are long, the work is hard, and the nearest city is 3 hours away." Amy looked around at the mountains, the peaceful ranch, the life she'd been building here over the past few months. "You know what's funny? 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be considering living on a remote ranch, I'd have thought they were crazy. I was a city person through and through. And now?" Amy smiled. "Now I think maybe I was just a ranch person who didn't know it yet." Over the following weeks, Amy found herself spending more and more time at the ranch. She started keeping clothes there, helping with early morning chores, staying for dinner and evening conversations by the fire. Her relationship with Jake had evolved from patient and reluctant rescuer to teacher and student, and then to something that felt like partnership. They worked well together, complemented each other's strengths, and had developed an easy friendship based on shared experience and mutual respect. "I need to ask you something," Amy said one night as they sat by Jake's fireplace. "Do you think you saved my life that night because you cared about me as a person, or because you were trying to save the squad mates you couldn't save in Afghanistan?" Jake was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. "Honestly, probably both. I did care about you. You were a human being in need, and I couldn't just let you die. But you're right that it was also about my own guilt and regret." Amy nodded. "I thought so, and you know what? I think that's okay. I think maybe we all need second chances to get it right." "Does that mean you forgive me?" Jake asked quietly. Amy looked at him. This man who had saved her life by changing it completely, who had shown her that survival was possible, who had helped her discover strengths she didn't know she had? "I think," she said slowly, "that forgiveness isn't really the right word anymore. I don't forgive you for saving my life, Jake. I thank you for it. For the first time since that terrible night during the blizzard, Jake smiled without any sadness in his eyes. And for the first time since waking up without her leg, Amy felt truly grateful to be alive. 8 months after the blizzard that changed everything, Amy stood in her sister Lisa's apartment looking at two plane tickets on the kitchen table. One was a ticket back to the city where she'd lived before the accident. The other was a ticket to nowhere, just a symbol of the choice she had to make. "The company wants you back," Lisa said, pouring coffee for both of them. "Full salary, flexible schedule, and they'll accommodate any needs you have because of your leg. It's a good offer, Amy." Amy picked up the job offer letter and read through it again. Her old marketing firm was offering her a senior position, better than what she'd had before. They'd even agreed to let her work from home 2 days a week. On paper, it was everything she should want. "And Jake?" Lisa asked gently. "What does he want?" Amy sighed. "He won't say. Every time I bring up the future, he changes the subject. I think he's afraid to ask me to stay because he doesn't want to influence my decision." Over the past few months, Amy's relationship with Jake had deepened into something neither of them had expected. It wasn't just friendship anymore, and it wasn't just shared understanding of their disabilities. Somewhere between learning to ride horses again and planning their therapeutic ranch program, they'd fallen in love. It had happened slowly, naturally, without either of them really noticing until one evening when Jake had kissed her goodnight and it felt like the most normal thing in the world. They'd been together ever since, but they'd avoided talking about what it meant for Amy's future. "Do you love him?" Lisa asked. "Yes," Amy said without hesitation. "But I don't know if that's enough. Lisa, I've never lived anywhere but the city. I don't know anything about ranching or rural life. What if I get up there and realize I've made a huge mistake?" Lisa sat down across from her sister. "Amy, in the 8 months since your accident, I've watched you transform into someone I barely recognize. You're stronger, more confident, more purposeful than you've ever been. And most of that change happened after you started spending time at Jake's ranch." Amy knew her sister was right. The person she'd become over the past few months was someone she actually liked. The city version of herself had been successful, but not particularly happy. She'd been going through the motions of a life that looked good from the outside, but felt empty on the inside. "What if I'm just running away?" Amy asked. "What if I'm choosing the ranch because it feels safe, not because it's what I really want?" "Then you'll figure that out and make a different choice," Lisa said. "Amy, you survived a car accident, a life-threatening infection, losing your leg and learning to walk again. I think you can handle whatever comes next." That afternoon, Amy drove up to the ranch one more time. She found Jake in the barn working on plans for the therapeutic riding program they'd been developing. Drawings and notes were spread across a makeshift table, and he looked up with a smile when he saw her. "How'd the meeting with your old company go?" he asked. "They offered me the job," Amy said, sitting down beside him. "Good salary, flexible schedule, all the accommodations I could want." Jake's smile faded a little. "That's great. I'm happy for you." Amy could hear the forced enthusiasm in his voice. "Jake, we need to talk about us, about what happens next." Jake set down his pencil and turned to face her. "Amy, I want you to know that whatever you decide, I support it. You have a life in the city, a career, family, and friends. I can't ask you to give all that up for a ranch in the middle of nowhere." "You're not asking," Amy said. "I'm choosing." Jake looked confused. "Choosing what?" Amy stood up and walked to the barn door, looking out at the mountains, the horses in the pasture, the life she'd been building here. "Jake, before the accident, I thought I had everything figured out. I had a plan, a career path, a vision of what my life would look like. But you know what? I was just existing, not really living." She turned back to face him. "These past few months working here with you, planning our program, learning what I'm actually capable of, this is the first time in my adult life that I felt truly alive. Not just surviving, but thriving." Jake stood up slowly, hope beginning to show in his eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that 8 months ago, you made a choice to save my life without asking my permission. And today I'm making a choice." to really live it with your permission or without it. Jake crossed the barn in 3 quick steps and pulled Amy into his arms. Are you sure? Really sure? Because once you decide to stay, I'm never letting you go. Amy laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months, I'm sure. Besides, someone needs to keep you in line when you start thinking you can perform surgery in your kitchen. They kissed, and Amy felt like she was finally home. Not the home she'd grown up in, or the apartment she'd lived in before the accident, but a real home built on understanding, shared purpose, and love that had grown out of the worst and best moments of their lives. 6 months later, Amy and Jake officially opened Second Chances Ranch, a working ranch and therapeutic riding program for amputees and others with physical disabilities. Amy had used her marketing background to secure funding and publicity, while Jake provided the medical knowledge and ranch expertise. Their first group of participants included a veteran who'd lost both legs, a teenager who'd survived bone cancer, and a middle-aged woman who'd lost her arm in a car accident. Amy watched them arrive, seeing in their faces the same mixture of fear, anger, and desperate hope that she'd felt when she first came to the ranch. Think we can help them? Jake asked, as they stood on the porch watching their guests settle in. I think we can show them what you showed me, Amy replied, taking his hand. That losing something doesn't mean losing everything. That different doesn't mean broken. That sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads to the best thing that could happen to you. That evening, as Amy and Jake sat by the fire with their guests, sharing stories and beginning the process of healing, Amy thought about the choice Jake had made during that terrible blizzard. He'd chosen to save her life by changing it completely. And now she was choosing to live that life fully, not in spite of what had happened to her, but because of it. The storm that had brought them together was long over, but the life they'd built from its aftermath was just beginning. Amy no longer wondered what would have happened if Jake had honored her desperate plea that night. Instead, she was grateful every day that he'd had the courage to do the unthinkable, to save her from giving up on herself. Outside, snow began to fall gently, the first snow of the new winter. But inside the ranch house, warmed by fire and purpose and love, Amy and Jake and their guests planned for tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. Because sometimes the most beautiful thing about life isn't that it goes according to plan, but that it doesn't, and in the unexpected detours, you find exactly where you're supposed to be.